25 centuries ago, a man sat beneath a tree and refused to move until he understood the nature of suffering itself. He had no army, no throne, no scripture written in his name, not yet. When he rose, he was no longer a prince. He was the Buddha, the one who is awake. What happened next defies every rule of how ideas are supposed to travel. No conquest carried it. No single ruler forced it on the masses at the edge of a sword. And yet, within 1,000 years, this one man's insight had crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans, reshaping the inner life of nearly half the human beings on Earth. This is the story of how a single mind became a civilization of minds, how silence became empire, and how the most radical idea in human history spread not through conquest, but through contagion. Around 563 BCE, in the foothills of the Himalayas, a boy named Siddhartha Gautama was born into the Shakya clan, a ruling family of what is now the Nepal-India border. His father, King Suddhodana, had heard a prophecy. This child would become either a great emperor or a great renunciate who would abandon the throne entirely. Determined to steer fate, the king built his son a world with no ugliness in it, no sickness, no poverty, no death, just gardens, music, and pleasure sealed inside palace walls. For 29 years it worked. Then, on a single ride outside the palace, Siddhartha saw what his father had spent a lifetime hiding from him. An old man bent and frail, a sick man shaking with fever, a corpse being carried to cremation, and finally, a wandering ascetic, a man who had given up everything and yet radiated a strange, unshakable calm. 4 sights, and nothing was ever the same again. That night, Siddhartha did something almost incomprehensible for a man of his position. He left his wife, his newborn son, his kingdom, his name, and walked into the forest with nothing. What followed were 6 years of extremity. He studied under the greatest meditation masters of his day and surpassed them. He starved himself nearly to death, believing suffering itself was the path to liberation until he collapsed by a riverbank, too weak to stand. It was there, at his lowest point, that he arrived at an idea that would outlive every empire built after him. The middle way, not indulgence, not self-destruction. A path between. He sat beneath a fig tree in a place now called Bodh Gaya and vowed not to move until he understood the root of suffering itself. Legend says he was tempted by Mara, a demon of desire and fear who sent illusions, armies, and temptation to break his resolve. He did not break. At dawn, watching the morning star rise, Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha. He had found what he called the 4 noble truths: that suffering exists, that it has a cause, that it can end, and that there is a path to end it. Simple words. But inside them was a complete reprogramming of how a human being could relate to pain, desire, and death. He was 35 years old. He had 45 years left to live. And he was about to become the single most influential teacher in human history, armed with nothing but a voice and a willingness to talk to anyone who would listen. The Buddha's first move after enlightenment tells you everything about why this teaching spread the way it did. He didn't retreat into permanent silence. He walked to Sarnath, found the 5 ascetics who had once been his companions, and delivered his first sermon, what Buddhist tradition calls turning the wheel of the dharma. And then he kept walking. For the next 4 decades, the Buddha did not stay in one place building a temple or a monument to himself. He walked across the Gangetic plain of northern India, teaching kings and beggars with the same patience, adapting his language to whoever sat in front of him, using a farmer's metaphor for a farmer, a merchant's logic for a merchant. This is the first reason Buddhism spread. Where other ideas stalled, it made no distinction of caste. In a society rigidly stratified by birth, the Buddha accepted disciples regardless of social class, a radical act that some historians argue was as significant to the religion's early growth as any doctrine it taught. He also did something structurally brilliant. He built an institution designed to outlive him, the Sangha, a community of monks and nuns bound not by bloodline or geography, but by shared discipline and shared teaching. Monks owned almost nothing. They walked from village to village, begging for food, teaching in exchange for nothing but attention. This meant the teaching didn't depend on the Buddha's physical presence. It could replicate. A monk trained in one town could walk to the next and plant the same seed. By the time the Buddha died around 483 BCE at the age of 80, reportedly from food poisoning after a meal offered by a blacksmith named Kunda, his teaching was already established across several kingdoms of northern India. His final words, as recorded in tradition, were simple. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. But a regional teaching, however beloved, is not yet a world religion. For that, Buddhism needed something the Buddha never had and never wanted: power. 2 centuries after the Buddha's death, a man named Ashoka sat on the throne of the Mauryan Empire, the largest empire the Indian subcontinent had ever seen. Ashoka had not gotten there gently. Ancient sources describe him as ruthless, even murderous, in securing his throne, and he expanded his empire through relentless military conquest. In 261 BCE, Ashoka turned his armies on the kingdom of Kalinga, on India's eastern coast. The conquest succeeded. But the cost broke something in him. Ashoka's own inscriptions carved into stone pillars that still stand today describe witnessing the aftermath: over 100,000 dead, many more displaced, entire communities shattered. He wrote, in words historians still study for their raw honesty, that the suffering of Kalinga weighed on him and that he resolved never to wage war of conquest again. Ashoka converted to Buddhism. And what he did next changed the trajectory of the religion permanently. He didn't just adopt Buddhism as personal belief. He used the full machinery of the largest empire in Asia to promote it. He commissioned tens of thousands of stupas and monuments across the subcontinent. He carved edicts into rock faces and pillars in the local languages of his people, not in the elite court language, but in the vernacular, so ordinary people could actually read his message of nonviolence, tolerance, and moral conduct. And then he did something no ruler had done with a religious teaching before at this scale. He exported it. Ashoka is credited with sending Buddhist missionaries not just across India, but beyond it entirely to Sri Lanka, where his own son Mahinda is said to have carried the teaching and established it as the island's dominant faith, westward toward the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Mediterranean, and into Central Asia. This is the hinge point of the entire story. Without Ashoka, Buddhism plausibly remains a respected regional Indian philosophy, one among many. With Ashoka, it becomes something else: state-sponsored, empire-scaled, and pointed outward across trade routes that were about to explode in size. In Sri Lanka, the teaching took hold so completely that the island became and remains today one of the oldest continuously Buddhist societies on earth, preserving scriptures and traditions that would later help reconstruct lost texts elsewhere in the Buddhist world. Ashoka gave Buddhism its first true empire. But the next several centuries would give it something even more powerful: a road. By the 1st century BCE, a network of trade routes stretched from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean world, what we now call the Silk Road. Silk moved along it. So did spices, glass, horses, and gold. And so did monks. Buddhist monks attached themselves to merchant caravans for safety and provision, and in return they offered something merchants making the brutal. Months-long crossing badly needed: spiritual comfort, ritual protection, and community at the oasis towns where caravans stopped to rest. Monasteries sprang up along the route at Dunhuang, at Kashgar, at Khotan, becoming way stations that were as much economic infrastructure as they were spiritual centers. Merchants funded these monasteries. Monasteries, in turn, gave merchants a reason to stop, rest, and reinvest in the towns along the route. It was a symbiosis, trade fueling faith, faith fueling trade. By the 1st century C, Buddhism had entered China, most likely carried first by these Silk Road monks and merchant communities rather than by any single dramatic conversion event. Chinese court records from the Han Dynasty mention Buddhist practice reaching the imperial court, though scholars debate the exact timeline. China did not receive Buddhism easily. The teaching had to negotiate with a civilization already saturated in Confucian social order and Taoist philosophy. Early Chinese translators sometimes borrowed Taoist vocabulary to explain Buddhist concepts. Because there was no existing Chinese word for ideas like nirvana, a strategy that made the foreign religion feel less foreign, even as it sometimes blurred the original meaning. One of the most consequential figures in this transmission was a monk named Kumarajiva, born in Kucha along the Silk Road in the 4th century CE. Brought to the Chinese capital reportedly against his will, as a prize of war between rival warlords, Kumarajiva went on to lead a translation bureau that rendered hundreds of Sanskrit Buddhist texts into Chinese with a clarity and elegance that made them accessible for the first time to a mass Chinese readership. Without accurate translation, Buddhism remains a curiosity. With it, Buddhism becomes literature, philosophy, and practice that an entire civilization can actually study. From China, the teaching didn't stop. It moved into Korea by the 4th century, and from Korea, in the 6th century, it crossed the water into Japan, where it would eventually reshape Japanese art, architecture, and imperial politics for over 1,000 years. By the time this chain of transmission was finished, Buddhism had traveled roughly 5,000 miles from the tree where it began, not through a single directive, but through thousands of individual monks, translators, and merchants, each one carrying the teaching one town further than the last. While Buddhism moved east through China, it also climbed north into one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, the Tibetan Plateau. Buddhism reached Tibet significantly later than China, traditionally dated to the 7th century CE under King Songtsen Gampo, who is said to have married Buddhist princesses from both Nepal and China, each reportedly bringing sacred images and texts with her as part of the marriage. But it was in the 8th century that Tibetan Buddhism truly took its distinct shape, when a tantric master named Padmasambhava, revered in Tibet as Guru Rinpoche, is said to have subdued local spirits and established the religion firmly enough to survive. What emerged wasn't a simple transplant of Indian Buddhism. It fused with Tibet's existing Bon spiritual traditions, producing a distinct Vajrayana form, the diamond vehicle, with its own elaborate rituals, monastic universities, and eventually its own line of reincarnated spiritual leaders, including the institution that would become the Dalai Lama centuries later. Meanwhile, a different current of Buddhism was moving through Southeast Asia, not primarily along the overland Silk Road, but by sea, carried by Indian and Sri Lankan traders across the Bay of Bengal. By the early centuries CE, Buddhist ideas were taking root in what is now Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Indonesia, often existing alongside, and sometimes blending with, Hindu influence that had arrived through the same maritime trade routes. Over time, the Theravada tradition, closer in form to the earliest teachings preserved in Sri Lanka, became dominant across much of mainland Southeast Asia, while spectacular monuments like Cambodia's Angkor complex and Indonesia's Borobudur stand today as evidence of just how deeply the teaching embedded itself into royal and civic identity in the region. Borobudur alone, built in the 9th century in Java, contains over 2,000 relief panels and hundreds of Buddha statues, arranged so that a pilgrim walking its terraces in a specific order symbolically walks the entire path from worldly desire to enlightenment. Stone, shaped into a three-dimensional sermon. By roughly 1200 CE, some 17 centuries after a prince walked out of a palace in northern India, Buddhism, in its many transformed and localized forms, stretched continuously from Afghanistan to Japan, from Mongolia to Indonesia. No other idea born in that era of the ancient world had traveled so far, absorbed so many local cultures, and remained recognizably itself. Here is the part of the story most documentaries skip. Buddhism nearly disappeared from the very land that birthed it. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a combination of factors, the resurgence of devotional Hindu movements that absorbed many Buddhist ideas, and even the Buddha himself as a Hindu deity, the loss of royal patronage, and devastating raids on major monastic universities like Nalanda left Buddhism a minority faith in India, the very ground where it began. The great library of Nalanda, which had drawn scholars from across Asia for over 700 years, was destroyed in the early 13th century, its collections reportedly burning for months. It's one of history's strangest ironies. Buddhism succeeded so completely at becoming a world religion that it could afford to lose its birthplace almost entirely and keep growing everywhere else. For centuries afterward, Buddhism existed almost entirely as an Asian phenomenon until European colonial encounters in the 19th century. And later waves of immigration and cultural exchange in the 20th century introduced it to Western audiences on a large scale. Scholars translated ancient texts into European languages. Figures like the 14th Dalai Lama, forced into exile after 1959, became global ambassadors for a tradition once confined to the Himalayas. Meditation practices, stripped of some religious context and rebranded around mindfulness, entered Western psychology, medicine, and corporate wellness programs by the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Today, estimates place the number of Buddhists worldwide somewhere between 500 million and well over 1 billion. Depending on how practice and cultural identity are counted spread across nearly every country on Earth, in forms ranging from strict monastic tradition to secular mindfulness meditation completely detached from any temple. Think about what actually happened here. One man sat beneath a tree with no plan to build an empire. No army, no scripture yet written. He simply refused to look away from suffering until he understood it. Everything after that, the wandering monks, the emperor who turned an army into a mission, the translators who bent entire languages to hold a foreign idea, the sailors and merchants who carried it across oceans, the mountain kingdoms that remade it in their own image, all of it grew from a single insight, shared freely, with no restriction on who was allowed to hear it. Ideas that demand nothing but attention have a strange kind of power. They cannot be conquered, because they were never a territory. They cannot be starved out, because they cost nothing to carry. A soldier can kill a man. He cannot kill a thought that has already been planted in 10,000 minds. 25 centuries later, that thought is still spreading.